The people who quietly change your life are often the ones you never expected to meet. Rain poured relentlessly across the streets of downtown Boston, turning sidewalks into shimmering mirrors beneath the glow of traffic lights, while hurried pedestrians disappeared beneath umbrellas and awnings. The steady rhythm of falling rain echoed against glass storefronts and passing buses as the city continued moving despite the storm. Most people hurried past without looking around. They had places to be, appointments to keep, and schedules that mattered more than the weather. Grace Sullivan was no different. At 31 years old, she balanced 2 grocery bags in one hand while holding the small hand of her 5-year-old son, Liam, with the other. Every dollar she earned mattered, and every minute of every day was carefully planned. After finishing a morning shift at a neighborhood bakery, she had stopped at the grocery store before walking home because the bus fare was one expense she preferred to save whenever possible. Her light beige coat was already soaked through despite the small umbrella she held above Liam's head instead of her own. She smiled anyway. "Are you cold?" she asked gently. Liam shook his head while pulling his blue rain jacket tighter around himself. "You are wetter than me." Grace laughed softly. "That is part of being a mom." Liam smiled proudly. "Then when I grow up, I will hold the umbrella for you." Grace's heart warmed despite the cold rain surrounding them. "I will remember that promise." They continued walking through the busy intersection where cars crawled carefully across rain-slick streets. Suddenly, Liam slowed. "Mom," he whispered. Grace followed his gaze. Standing alone beneath the awning of a closed flower shop was a little girl no older than 5, wearing a pale pink coat completely soaked by the storm. Her small shoes were covered with puddle water, and tears mixed with raindrops as she looked desperately in every direction. There were no adults nearby. Grace immediately set the grocery bags beneath the awning before kneeling beside the child. "Hi there," she said with gentle warmth. "Are you all right?" The little girl shook her head, trying bravely not to cry. "I cannot find my daddy." Grace smiled reassuringly. "Do you know your name?" "Emily." "That is a beautiful name." Grace carefully wrapped her own scarf around the little girl's shoulders before holding the umbrella over both children. Liam stepped closer without being asked. "You can stand next to me," he offered kindly. Emily smiled through tears. "Thank you." Grace looked around the crowded street once more. No one appeared to be searching nearby. She gently asked, "Do you know your daddy's phone number?" Emily shook her head. "Only his name." "What is his name?" Emily answered quietly. "Nathan Walker." Grace's expression remained calm, even though the name sounded familiar. Before she could think further, she noticed a police officer directing traffic at the next intersection. "Let us stay right here where it is safe," she told both children. "I am going to ask for help." Just as she stepped toward the officer, a convoy of black luxury vehicles suddenly slowed beside the sidewalk. Several men in dark suits quickly stepped out, scanning the street with visible concern. One of them called urgently, "Emily." The little girl immediately looked up. "Daddy." A tall man emerged from the rear vehicle, his expensive charcoal overcoat already darkened by the rain as he hurried toward the frightened child. Relief filled his face the instant Emily ran into his arms. He knelt immediately, embracing her tightly before checking that she was unharmed. "I have been looking everywhere for you," he whispered with unmistakable emotion. Emily pointed toward Grace. "She helped me." The man slowly stood while holding his daughter close. His attention shifted toward Grace for the first time. Their eyes met across the rain. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice carrying genuine gratitude rather than formality. "You kept my daughter safe." Grace smiled politely. She was very brave. Liam stepped beside his mother, looking curiously at the stranger without saying a word. The man gently introduced himself. "My name is Nathan Walker." Grace nodded. "Grace Sullivan." Nathan looked toward the soaked grocery bags resting beside the flower shop entrance, then back at Grace's rain-soaked coat. Without hesitation, he removed his own expensive overcoat and offered it to her. Grace immediately shook her head. "You need it more." Nathan smiled faintly. "My daughter is already warm again because of you." Rain continued falling steadily around them as Grace hesitated. Finally, she accepted the coat only to drape it around Liam instead of herself. Nathan quietly noticed the gesture. He said nothing, but something about that simple act stayed with him. As Grace gathered the grocery bags and prepared to continue home, Nathan watched her walk away through the rain with Liam holding one hand and Emily waving enthusiastically from his arms. Without fully understanding why, he quietly instructed his driver to wait a moment longer. His eyes remained fixed on the small family disappearing down the wet sidewalk, unaware that this chance encounter in the rain had already begun changing the course of all their lives. Grace continued walking through the rain with Liam wrapped securely inside Nathan's expensive overcoat, while the grocery bags grew heavier with every passing block. Behind them, the line of black vehicles remained parked along the curb for several quiet moments. Nathan still stood beside the open rear door with Emily resting safely in his arms, watching the small family disappear into the steady curtain of rain. One of his security officers stepped closer. "Sir, the doctor has already arrived at your residence to examine Miss Emily." Nathan nodded without taking his eyes off the sidewalk where Grace had vanished. "Good." The officer hesitated before asking, "Should we leave?" Nathan finally looked toward his driver. "Not yet." Emily gently touched her father's sleeve. "Daddy." Nathan smiled warmly at his daughter. "Yes." Emily pointed down the street where Grace and Liam had disappeared. "They are still getting wet." Nathan looked thoughtfully toward the rain-soaked sidewalk. Without another word, he quietly entered the vehicle. "Follow them," he instructed calmly. The driver glanced into the rearview mirror. "At a distance?" Nathan nodded. "Do not disturb them." Several blocks ahead, Grace finally reached the modest townhouse she rented on the edge of an older neighborhood. The small white porch showed signs of age, and flower boxes beneath the front windows had begun filling with rainwater, yet the house remained warm and carefully maintained. She unlocked the front door, while Liam carefully carried one of the grocery bags inside. "Can I keep wearing the coat for a little longer?" he asked with a hopeful smile. Grace laughed softly. "Only until you are warm." She hung the soaked umbrella near the entrance before gently drying Liam's hair with a towel. Through the living room window, neither of them noticed the black sedan quietly stopping half a block away beneath a row of maple trees. Nathan remained seated inside, without saying a word. He watched Grace switch on the porch light, kneel to remove Liam's wet shoes, and then carry the grocery bags into the kitchen. There was nothing remarkable about the small house itself. Yet something about the peaceful routine unfolding inside quietly held his attention. Emily looked out the same window. "They are home." Nathan nodded. "Yes." Emily smiled happily. "The nice lady takes good care of her little boy." Nathan looked again toward the softly lit window where Grace now prepared hot chocolate, while Liam proudly unpacked groceries beside her. "She certainly does." After several moments, he quietly instructed the driver to leave. He never intended to intrude upon their lives. He only wanted to know they had arrived safely. Meanwhile, inside the townhouse, Liam wrapped both hands around a warm mug before asking the question that had been waiting quietly inside his thoughts ever since the rainstorm. "Mom." Grace looked up from the kitchen sink. "Yes, sweetheart." The man with the little girl seemed sad. Grace paused. "Why do you think that?" Liam looked thoughtfully at the steam rising from his hot chocolate. Because he smiled, but his eyes looked lonely. Grace slowly sat beside him at the small kitchen table. "Sometimes people carry things inside that other people cannot see." Liam nodded seriously. "Like missing somebody." Grace looked out toward the rain-covered window without answering immediately. Sometimes. Across the city, Nathan finally returned to his penthouse overlooking Boston Harbor. Emily had already changed into warm pajamas before curling up beside him on the sofa with her favorite blanket. "Daddy?" she whispered sleepily. "Yes." "Can the nice lady come visit someday?" Nathan smiled gently. "Why would you like that?" Emily hugged the blanket closer. "Because she made the rain stop feeling scary." Nathan brushed a strand of hair away from her forehead. "She was very kind." Emily closed her eyes. Her little boy was kind too. Nathan remained quietly thoughtful after she fell asleep. The image of Grace wrapping her own scarf around Emily before thinking about herself returned again and again. So did the sight of Liam wearing his expensive overcoat, while Grace continued walking through the rain without one. He had spent years surrounded by wealth, influence, and people eager to impress him. Yet the simple generosity shown by a stranger expecting nothing in return affected him more deeply than he wanted to admit. Early the next morning, Nathan arrived at Montgomery Capital headquarters before sunrise. His executive assistant, Claire Donovan, noticed he was already standing beside the office windows. "You are here early," she observed kindly. Nathan nodded. Claire, I have a favor to ask. She waited patiently. Yesterday's incident involving Emily. He paused briefly. I would like to send flowers and replace the groceries that were ruined in the rain. Claire smiled faintly. Do you know where to send them? Nathan looked out across the waking city. I know exactly where she lives. Then, almost as though speaking only to himself, he quietly added, I just do not know why it suddenly feels so important that I thank her properly. The following afternoon arrived beneath a clear autumn sky, making the previous day's relentless rain feel almost impossible to believe. Grace had already finished her early shift at the neighborhood bakery and returned home before noon. The small townhouse carried the comforting aroma of fresh bread she had brought home for lunch, while Liam sat at the kitchen table carefully coloring another picture of airplanes and rain clouds. Life had quietly returned to its familiar rhythm, yet neither of them had completely forgotten the frightened little girl they had helped or the father who had looked at Grace with such sincere gratitude. A gentle knock sounded at the front door. Grace wiped her hands on a kitchen towel before opening it. Standing on the porch was a delivery driver holding several large grocery boxes beside an elegant bouquet of white lilies wrapped in simple brown paper. Delivery for Miss Grace Sullivan, he said politely. Grace blinked in surprise. There must be some mistake. The driver checked his electronic receipt. The address is correct. He handed her a small envelope attached to the flowers. Everything has already been paid for. After thanking him, Grace carried the groceries inside, while Liam hurried over with wide eyes. Who sent them? Grace carefully opened the envelope. Inside rested a handwritten note on plain white stationery. Thank you for protecting the most precious person in my world. Please allow me to replace what the storm may have taken from yours. Nathan Walker. Grace quietly folded the note without speaking. Liam looked toward the groceries stacked neatly beside the kitchen counter. That is the little girl's daddy. Grace smiled softly. Yes. Liam looked thoughtful for a moment. He is nice. Grace could not disagree. Meanwhile, across the city, Nathan attempted to return his attention to work. A board meeting filled with investors, financial projections, and international expansion plans unfolded exactly as scheduled. Yet every few minutes his thoughts wandered back to a small white townhouse and the woman who had accepted nothing for herself while making certain both children remained warm in the rain. Claire Donovan quietly noticed the unusual distraction. After the meeting ended, she remained behind. You are still thinking about her. Nathan smiled faintly. Apparently, I am becoming predictable. Claire laughed softly. Only to someone who has worked beside you for 12 years. Nathan walked toward the window overlooking the city skyline. Do you believe kindness can change the direction of a person's life? Claire considered the question carefully. Sometimes one act of kindness reveals who someone truly is. Nathan nodded slowly. That is exactly what happened yesterday. Back at the townhouse, Grace unpacked the grocery boxes one by one. Fresh fruit, vegetables, bread, milk, pantry supplies, and even Liam's favorite breakfast cereal had all been thoughtfully included. There was nothing extravagant. Only practical necessities chosen with surprising care. Liam held up a small box of hot chocolate packets. He remembered. Grace looked puzzled. Remembered what? Liam smiled. Yesterday you said hot chocolate makes rainy days better. Grace paused. She had mentioned those exact words while standing beneath the flower shop awning. Nathan must have heard her. Something about that small detail touched her more deeply than the expensive groceries themselves. Late that afternoon, Grace walked with Liam to the nearby community park. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves while children laughed on playground equipment beneath bright blue skies. Liam raced toward the swings while Grace sat quietly on a nearby bench, enjoying the rare, peaceful moment. Several minutes later, another familiar voice reached her ears. Grace. She looked up in surprise. Nathan stood a few feet away holding Emily's hand. Neither of them had expected this meeting. Emily immediately smiled brightly. It is my rainy day friend. Liam looked over from the swings and waved enthusiastically. Within seconds, both children were happily running toward each other as though they had known one another for much longer than a single afternoon. Grace stood politely. I was not expecting to see you. Nathan smiled warmly. Neither was I. He glanced toward the children already laughing together near the playground. Perhaps they had other plans. Grace laughed softly despite herself. Emily proudly showed Liam a small toy airplane while he responded by demonstrating how far he could push the swing. Nathan watched them quietly before turning back toward Grace. I hope the groceries were not inappropriate. Grace shook her head gently. They were thoughtful. Nathan looked relieved. I simply wanted to say thank you properly. Grace smiled. You already did. A comfortable silence settled between them as they watched the children play beneath the afternoon sun. It was interrupted only when Emily suddenly called out happily from across the playground. Daddy, look. Liam says airplanes always know how to find their way home. Nathan looked toward the two children laughing together, unaware that those simple words would soon become far more meaningful than either adult could possibly imagine. The afternoon sunlight stretched gently across the neighborhood park as children filled the playground with laughter that drifted through the crisp autumn air. Emily and Liam had already become inseparable companions, chasing one another between the swings and climbing frames with the effortless trust only children could create within minutes. Nathan and Grace remained seated on the same wooden bench, quietly watching them, while the peaceful rhythm of the park softened the awkwardness that had existed between them only days before. Emily proudly held up the small toy airplane she had brought from home. Liam, she called happily. Let us see whose airplane flies farther. Liam grinned. Mine always comes back. Emily laughed. Then mine will follow it. They counted together before throwing both airplanes high into the gentle breeze. One glided smoothly across the playground before landing near a flower bed. The other circled unexpectedly and settled only a few feet from the park fountain. Both children raced after them with joyful excitement. Grace smiled as she watched. They became friends very quickly. Nathan nodded. Emily usually takes much longer to trust new people. He looked toward Grace thoughtfully. Perhaps she recognized kindness before she recognized friendship. Grace lowered her eyes for a moment, unsure how to answer such a sincere observation. Before she could speak, Emily and Liam returned carrying their paper airplanes, both laughing over whose had traveled farther. Emily suddenly reached for Liam's hand without hesitation. Come see the ducks. Liam nodded immediately. Together, they wandered only a short distance toward the small pond while remaining well within sight. Nathan watched them quietly before speaking again. You raised a remarkable little boy. Grace smiled with unmistakable pride. He teaches me as much as I teach him. Nathan glanced toward Liam. Yesterday, he offered his place beneath the umbrella before thinking about himself. Grace laughed softly. That sounds exactly like him. She looked toward the children again. He believes helping someone is never something that should wait. Nathan remained silent for several moments. Someone taught him that. Grace smiled gently. Life did. Their conversation was interrupted by a cheerful bark. A golden retriever happily ran across the grass carrying a bright red tennis ball before stopping beside Liam. The dog dropped the ball at his feet with an expectant wagging tail. Liam laughed and threw it several yards across the lawn. The dog sprinted after it immediately. Emily clapped excitedly. Again, while both children played with the friendly dog under its owner's watchful eye, Nathan quietly noticed Grace rubbing her hands together against the cool breeze. Without saying anything, he removed his light jacket and offered it to her. Grace immediately recognized the familiar gesture from the rainy afternoon. She smiled politely. I remember what happened last time. Nathan laughed softly. So do I. Grace accepted the jacket this time without protest. Thank you. Nathan simply nodded. There was no awkwardness between them now, only comfortable kindness. A short while later, the children wandered toward a nearby ice cream cart parked beside the walking trail. Nathan offered to buy treats for everyone. Grace hesitated. That is not necessary. Nathan smiled warmly. Perhaps not, but I would like to. Liam looked toward Grace rather than answering himself. She finally nodded. One small cone. Emily cheered happily. Several minutes later, all four sat together beneath a large maple tree enjoying vanilla ice cream, while golden leaves drifted gently through the air. Park visitors passing by smiled at what appeared to be an ordinary family sharing an ordinary afternoon. None of them knew how recently these four people had become connected. As Liam finished the last bite of his cone, he looked toward Nathan with quiet curiosity. Do you like airplanes too? Nathan smiled. Very much. Liam brightened immediately. Mom says airplanes always help people find where they belong. Nathan looked briefly toward Grace before answering. Your mom sounds very wise. Grace laughed quietly. He remembers everything I tell him. Nathan looked at Liam again. That is a wonderful habit. As the afternoon slowly faded toward evening, Grace stood to gather their things. We should head home before dinner. Emily looked disappointed. Already. Nathan gently touched her shoulder. We can always come back another day. Emily immediately looked toward Liam. Will you? Liam smiled confidently. Yes. Grace noticed the hopeful expression on Emily's face and quietly added, if our schedules allow. Nathan smiled appreciatively. I would like that. The children waved enthusiastically as the two families prepared to leave in opposite directions. Grace and Liam walked slowly toward the park entrance while Nathan and Emily headed back toward the waiting car. Halfway across the parking lot, Emily suddenly stopped walking. Daddy. Nathan looked down. Yes. She pointed toward Grace and Liam disappearing beneath the colorful trees. When I was lost in the rain, I think they were lost too. Nathan followed her gaze thoughtfully. Why do you say that? Emily smiled with the quiet certainty only a child possessed. Because now everybody smiles more than before. Nathan looked toward the small family one last time before opening the car door. For reasons he could not yet explain, Emily's simple words felt less like a child's imagination and more like the beginning of a truth that had been waiting patiently to reveal itself. The peaceful afternoon at the park remained in Nathan's thoughts long after he and Emily returned home. His spacious penthouse overlooked the Boston skyline, yet the silence inside felt strangely unfamiliar after spending several hours listening to two children laugh without worry. Emily placed her toy airplane on the coffee table before climbing onto the sofa with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She looked toward her father with the same thoughtful expression she had worn since leaving the park. Daddy. Nathan smiled gently. Yes. Emily hugged the blanket a little tighter. Can Liam come visit again? Nathan laughed softly. You made a very good friend. Emily nodded. He makes everything feel fun. She paused before adding quietly. His mommy smiles like Grandma used to. Nathan's expression softened. That is a beautiful compliment. Emily yawned before curling against the cushions. She feels safe. Nathan gently brushed a strand of hair away from her forehead. Those simple words stayed with him long after Emily had fallen asleep. Across town, Grace tucked Liam into bed after they finished a simple dinner together. The little boy carefully placed the paper airplane Emily had given him on the small shelf beside his favorite storybooks. I want to keep it safe, he explained proudly. Grace smiled warmly. I think Emily would like that. Liam looked toward her with unusual seriousness. Mom. Yes. Do you think Mr. Nathan has many friends? Grace considered the question. Why do you ask? Liam stared thoughtfully at the airplane. Because people who are lonely sometimes work a lot. Grace looked at her son with quiet surprise. That is a very grown-up thought. Liam shrugged. He looked happy today, but only when Emily laughed. Grace gently kissed his forehead. Good night, sweetheart. After Liam fell asleep, Grace sat at the small kitchen table organizing invoices from recent photography assignments. Business had been slow, and every dollar still mattered. Her aging laptop suddenly displayed an incoming email notification. She expected another request for event photographs. Instead, she found a message from Montgomery Foundation. Curious, she opened it carefully. Dear Miss Sullivan, thank you once again for your kindness toward Miss Emily Walker. Our foundation will be hosting a children's aviation community fair next Saturday and would be honored if you and Liam would attend as our guests. Transportation and meals will be provided. Warm regards, Claire Donovan. Grace read the invitation twice before quietly closing the laptop. She had no reason to refuse, yet accepting somehow felt like stepping into something larger than a simple community event. The following morning, Nathan arrived at Montgomery Capital before sunrise. His schedule remained filled with board meetings and investor presentations, but his attention drifted repeatedly toward the invitation Claire had arranged. During a break between meetings, Claire quietly entered his office carrying a folder requiring his signature. The invitations have been delivered, she said. Nathan looked up. Did Miss Sullivan respond? Claire smiled faintly. Not yet. Nathan nodded slowly, trying not to appear disappointed by the perfectly reasonable answer. She will decide what is best for her family. Claire watched him thoughtfully. May I ask you something? Nathan smiled. You usually do. Claire folded her hands. When was the last time you looked forward to seeing someone outside of work? Nathan leaned back quietly, surprised by the question itself. After several seconds, he answered honestly. I cannot remember. Claire smiled gently. Perhaps that is worth paying attention to. Saturday arrived beneath clear blue skies. The community aviation fair filled a large public park beside the harbor with restored aircraft displays, educational exhibits, charity booths, and activities for children. Families wandered happily between tents while volunteers distributed paper pilot wings and model airplane kits. Nathan spent the morning greeting sponsors before joining Emily near the children's exhibit. Every few minutes, she looked toward the entrance. "Do you think they are coming?" she asked hopefully. Nathan smiled. "If they do, it will be a pleasant surprise." Almost at that exact moment, Grace and Liam walked through the entrance carrying only a small backpack and wide smiles. Liam immediately noticed Emily waving enthusiastically from across the lawn. He waved back just as excitedly before looking toward Grace for permission. She laughed softly. "You may go." Liam ran across the grass, while Emily hurried toward him at the same time. They met in the middle, laughing as though only a single day had passed since their last adventure together. Nathan watched the joyful reunion with quiet gratitude before lifting his eyes toward Grace. She stood several yards away beneath the bright autumn sun, smiling as she watched the children. For reasons he could not explain, seeing her there made the entire crowded festival suddenly feel much more like home than any place had in years. The aviation fair quickly became the happiest afternoon either child had experienced in months. Emily and Liam hurried from one exhibit to another, climbing inside restored training aircraft under the supervision of museum volunteers, folding paper gliders, and laughing every time one of their airplanes flew farther than expected. Nathan and Grace followed at a comfortable distance, allowing the children the freedom to explore while quietly enjoying the rare simplicity of the day. The constant pressure that usually surrounded Nathan seemed to fade with every smile Emily shared. Grace noticed it almost immediately. Away from conference rooms and cameras, he looked less like one of the country's most successful executives and more like an ordinary father trying to create happy memories for his daughter. Liam ran back, carrying a small wooden model airplane he had assembled himself. "Look," he said proudly. "It actually spins." Nathan accepted it carefully and turned the tiny propeller with genuine admiration. "You did an excellent job." Liam's face brightened. "Really?" Nathan nodded. "Very much." Grace watched the exchange in thoughtful silence. Liam rarely accepted praise from strangers so comfortably, yet with Nathan every conversation seemed effortless. A volunteer soon announced the beginning of a family scavenger hunt designed to encourage parents and children to explore the educational exhibits together. Emily immediately reached for Liam's hand. "We can be one team." Liam smiled. "Can our parents help too?" Emily looked toward Nathan while Liam looked toward Grace. Both adults laughed softly before agreeing. The four of them spent the next hour searching for clues hidden beside vintage aircraft, reading museum displays, and answering simple questions about aviation history. At one exhibit, participants were asked to write on a small card what home meant to them before hanging it on a large decorative wall shaped like an airplane wing. Emily carefully printed, "Home is wherever Daddy smiles." Liam took much longer to think. Finally, he wrote in careful block letters, "Home is where people help each other." Grace quietly read his card while pretending to straighten it on the display. Nathan happened to notice at the same moment. Neither of them spoke, yet both understood the quiet beauty inside such simple words. As the afternoon continued, the children wandered toward a demonstration tent where visitors learned how rescue teams used helicopters during emergencies. Grace stopped briefly to answer a phone call from the bakery manager confirming her work schedule for the following week. Nathan remained nearby with the children, helping them climb into a stationary rescue helicopter while volunteers explained its equipment. Emily happily pointed at every instrument. Liam listened with complete concentration before asking thoughtful questions that surprised the volunteer. "He is very curious," Nathan observed warmly. The volunteer smiled. "Children who ask questions usually become adults who solve problems." Nathan looked toward Liam with quiet admiration. "I believe that." When Grace returned a few minutes later, she found Nathan kneeling beside both children while helping them fasten miniature pilot wings onto their jackets. The simple sight unexpectedly stirred something inside her. It looked so natural that for a brief moment, she forgot they had known each other only a short time. The afternoon ended with a community raffle where every child received a small keepsake regardless of winning. Emily chose a compass keychain. Liam selected a notebook decorated with vintage airplanes. As they prepared to leave, the event coordinator approached Nathan carrying a weathered storage envelope discovered while organizing historical materials for the aviation fair. "Mr. Walker," she said politely, "these were found in boxes from one of our charity aviation programs several years ago. We noticed your foundation's name on several documents and thought you might want them." Nathan accepted the envelope with polite curiosity. It appeared old, the edges slightly worn from years in storage. He thanked the coordinator without opening it immediately. Grace and Liam waved goodbye before walking toward the parking area while Emily hugged Liam one last time, promising they would meet again soon. Nathan watched them leave until they disappeared beyond the rows of parked cars. Only then did he look down at the forgotten envelope resting in his hands. Inside were faded event records, volunteer photographs, and a participant roster from an aviation outreach program held 6 years earlier. As he casually turned the first page, one familiar name immediately caught his attention: Grace Sullivan. Nathan slowly stopped walking. Beneath her name, listed as the volunteer coordinator assigned to assist her throughout the event, appeared another name: Nathan Walker. He stared at the page without moving as the first faint fragments of a memory long buried quietly began returning. The evening sky had already turned deep blue by the time Nathan arrived home, yet the weathered envelope remained unopened on the passenger seat beside him until he reached the quiet privacy of his study. Emily had fallen asleep during the drive, still holding the small compass keychain she had won at the aviation fair, and the peaceful silence inside the penthouse made every rustle of the old document seem louder than it should have been. Nathan carefully removed the brittle pages one by one. Volunteer schedules, equipment inventories, event photographs faded slightly with age. Then his attention settled on a handwritten attendance log. Grace Sullivan, direct volunteer liaison, Nathan Walker. His fingers stopped moving. A memory returned unexpectedly. Rain had begun falling just after sunset that evening 6 years earlier. A young volunteer carrying camera equipment had laughed while apologizing for accidentally spilling coffee across one of his presentation folders. He had told her it was only paper. She had answered that kindness was harder to replace than paper. Nathan slowly closed his eyes. He remembered her smile. He remembered offering to help carry her equipment through the storm. Most of all, he remembered promising they would meet again after the charity program ended. He opened his eyes and looked toward the final document inside the envelope. Folded neatly between two event reports rested an unopened cream-colored envelope with his own name written across the front in elegant handwriting. Nathan carefully turned it over. The seal had never been broken. His heartbeat slowed. Before opening it, he called softly toward the hallway. Claire, his executive assistant, who had stayed behind to organize documents from the Foundation archive, entered a moment later. "Yes, sir." Nathan held up the envelope. "Do you recognize this?" Claire stepped closer. "It appears to have been filed inside the archive by mistake." Nathan looked at the date written in one corner. 6 years earlier. It was never delivered. Claire's expression changed immediately. "May I check the archive index?" Within minutes, she returned carrying a digital tablet. There was a storage transfer during the Foundation renovation that year. Several personal correspondence items were accidentally archived instead of forwarded. Nathan looked back down at the envelope. "Then she wrote to me." Claire nodded quietly. "It appears so." Across town, Grace tucked Liam into bed after another long but peaceful day. The little boy placed the wooden airplane from the aviation fair beside the paper airplane Emily had folded with him at the park. "They should stay together," he explained proudly. Grace smiled warmly. "I think they would like that." Liam looked thoughtfully toward his mother. "Do you think Emily misses me already?" Grace gently kissed his forehead. "Probably." Liam closed his eyes with a contented smile. "I miss her too." After he drifted to sleep, Grace quietly opened a small wooden memory box hidden inside her bedroom closet. Beneath old photographs and greeting cards rested several copies of letters she had written years ago but never expected anyone else to read. She gently touched the ribbon, holding them together before closing the box once again. Some memories, she believed, belonged only to the past. Back inside the penthouse, Nathan finally opened the forgotten envelope. The paper inside had yellowed slightly with time, yet the handwriting remained beautifully clear. "Dear Nathan, I do not know whether this letter will ever reach you. but I wanted to thank you for believing in someone who had almost stopped believing in herself. You reminded me that kindness can appear in the middle of a storm and quietly change the direction of a life. I hope one day we meet again when the skies are clear. Until then, please stay exactly the man I met beneath the rain. Grace. Nathan lowered the letter slowly. There was no accusation, no expectation, only gratitude. The realization struck him more deeply than any business victory ever had. She had remembered him all these years while believing he had simply disappeared. He whispered almost to himself, "I never left by choice." Claire quietly stood nearby without interrupting. After several moments, Nathan folded the letter carefully and looked toward her. "Find every archived correspondence from that year." Claire nodded. Immediately. The following afternoon, while sorting through additional storage boxes, a Foundation archivist discovered another sealed package hidden behind old event banners. Attached to the outside was a faded label that read, "Personal mail awaiting executive review." When the box arrived in Nathan's office, he carefully lifted the lid. Inside rested several unopened letters, all written in the same familiar handwriting. Every envelope carried the same return name, Grace Sullivan. The forgotten letters rested quietly across Nathan's desk, their faded envelopes arranged in chronological order as morning sunlight slowly filled the executive office. For several minutes, he simply looked at them without moving. Every unopened envelope represented a moment of life he had never known existed. Every date printed in the corner marked another opportunity that had silently disappeared before reaching him. Claire quietly closed the office door behind her, leaving Nathan alone with the years that had somehow waited inside a storage box. He carefully opened the first letter. "Dear Nathan, I hope this reaches you before too much time passes. I wanted to thank you again for everything you did during the aviation outreach event. You reminded me that kindness can appear when people least expect it. I would love to see you again if life ever gives us the chance." Nathan gently lowered the page before opening the second envelope. The handwriting remained just as graceful, but the tone had changed. Grace described several conversations they had shared after the charity program ended, mentioning how she had waited for his reply before eventually deciding he had become too busy to remember her. Nathan closed his eyes briefly. He had never received any of them. One letter followed another. Weeks became months. Then one envelope, slightly thicker than the others, stopped him completely. He unfolded the pages carefully. "Dear Nathan, today I learned that I am expecting a baby. I tried calling every number I had for you, but none of them reached you. I am writing because I believe you deserve to know before anyone else. I do not know what tomorrow will bring, but I already know this child deserves honesty. If you never received this letter, perhaps life had different plans for us." Nathan stopped reading as emotion tightened his throat. He stared silently at the page while every unanswered question from the past several weeks suddenly aligned into one unmistakable truth. Claire gently knocked before stepping inside. She immediately noticed the expression on his face. "Sir." Nathan looked up slowly. "She told me." Claire waited quietly. Nathan held out the letter with trembling hands. 6 years ago. Claire carefully read only enough to understand before lowering the page respectfully. Neither of them spoke for several long moments. Finally, Nathan whispered, "I never knew." Across town, Grace spent the afternoon helping Liam assemble a model airplane at the kitchen table. The little boy concentrated carefully while reading each instruction aloud. "Wing first," he announced proudly. Grace smiled warmly. "Exactly." Liam looked up unexpectedly. "Mom." "Yes." "If somebody loses a letter, is it their fault?" Grace paused, surprised by the question. "Not always." Liam thought quietly. "Then maybe people should ask before they become sad." Grace looked at him for a long moment before gently brushing his hair back. "That is very wise." Liam returned to his airplane without realizing how deeply his words had settled inside her heart. Back at Montgomery Capital, Nathan continued reading every remaining letter. Grace never asked for money. She never expressed anger. She never blamed him for disappearing. Instead, each page quietly documented milestones he had unknowingly missed. The first time the baby kicked. The first ultrasound. The first birthday. Liam's first day at preschool. Every letter ended with hope rather than resentment. The final envelope carried a date from only 1 year earlier. "Dear Nathan, I no longer know whether these letters will ever find you. Liam asks about his father sometimes. I tell him only good things because I still believe good people do not disappear without a reason. Wherever life has taken you, I hope you are happy. Nathan carefully folded the final page. Tears quietly blurred the handwriting before he placed every letter back into their envelopes with extraordinary care. Claire stood silently nearby until he finally spoke. Arrange a meeting with Grace Sullivan. She nodded immediately. Today. Nathan answered without hesitation. As soon as she is willing. That evening, Grace received an unexpected phone call while preparing dinner. The unfamiliar number almost went unanswered. Hello, she said politely. Claire introduced herself calmly before explaining who she represented. Grace remained completely silent throughout the explanation. Finally, she asked only one question. He read them. Claire answered gently. Everyone. Grace closed her eyes as years of quiet misunderstanding suddenly shifted beneath her feet. Tomorrow, she whispered softly. I will meet him tomorrow. After the call ended, she stood quietly in the kitchen while Liam continued building his model airplane nearby. He looked up with a cheerful smile. Mom, it flies now. Grace walked over and hugged him gently. Yes, she whispered. I think something else finally found its way home too. The following afternoon arrived beneath a brilliant blue sky that seemed almost symbolic after so many memories had been tied to rain. Grace walked slowly toward the quiet botanical garden where she had agreed to meet Nathan, choosing the peaceful location because neither of them wanted cameras, reporters, or curious strangers witnessing a conversation that belonged only to them. Liam remained at school while Emily spent the afternoon with her grandparents, giving both adults the privacy they needed for the first time in years. Nathan was already waiting beside a small reflecting pond when Grace arrived. He stood without speaking as she approached, the bundle of carefully preserved letters resting gently in his hands. Neither of them rushed the moment. Years of silence deserved patience. Grace stopped a few feet away. Nathan looked at her with quiet sincerity before holding out the letters. I finally read every one of them. Grace accepted them carefully, her fingers resting on the familiar envelopes she had once believed would never be seen. I never imagined they would find you after all this time. Nathan's voice remained calm, though emotion lingered beneath every word. They should have reached me years ago. Grace looked into his eyes and saw no hesitation, no excuses, only regret. I believed you chose not to answer. Nathan slowly shook his head. If I had received even the first letter, I would have come. Silence settled gently between them, but unlike before, it no longer felt painful. It felt honest. Nathan finally continued. I missed every birthday, every first day of school, every ordinary afternoon that mattered most. Not because I chose another life, but because I never knew the life waiting for me existed. Grace quietly lowered her eyes. For years I wanted to be angry with you. She smiled sadly. But I never could. Nathan stepped a little closer. Why? Grace answered without hesitation. Because the man I met in the rain 6 years ago was too kind to disappear on purpose. Nathan closed his eyes briefly as emotion tightened his voice. Thank you for believing that when I gave you no reason to. Grace gently unfolded one final letter she had kept separate from the others. There was one I never mailed. Nathan looked at the faded page as she handed it to him. He read it silently. It spoke of Liam taking his first steps, of late nights, of hope that one day father and son might meet even if life never brought Grace and Nathan together again. At the bottom she had written only one sentence. I hope our son grows up with your kindness. Nathan folded the letter carefully before looking toward Grace again. May I ask you something? She nodded softly. Anything. Does Liam know? Grace smiled gently. He knows his father is a good man who never stopped being part of his story, even if we could not find him. Nathan covered his face briefly with one hand before quietly laughing through tears. You protected my place in his heart even when you believed I had left. Grace answered simply. Children deserve hope. At that moment, small footsteps echoed along the garden path. Liam and Emily came running toward them hand in hand, followed at a respectful distance by Grace's neighbor, who had picked Liam up from school. The children immediately stopped when they noticed the adults standing together. Emily smiled first. Did you find each other? Nathan looked toward Grace before answering. She smiled through tears and nodded once. Nathan turned back toward the children. Yes. Liam looked thoughtfully between them. Then does that mean nobody is lost anymore? Grace knelt beside him, and gently brushed his hair away from his forehead. I think we all found our way home. Nathan slowly knelt beside them as well. Liam, there is something I should have told you a long time ago. The little boy looked into his eyes with quiet curiosity. Nathan gently took his small hand. I am your father. Liam did not seem surprised. Instead, he smiled softly, as though hearing something he had somehow known long before anyone else had spoken it aloud. I know, he whispered. Nathan blinked in astonishment. How? Liam shrugged with childlike certainty. It felt true. Emily happily slipped one hand into Liam's while Nathan and Grace stood beside them beneath the afternoon sunlight. Months later, the four of them returned together to the same street where the rain had first brought their lives together. The flower shop had reopened, brighter than before, and children laughed beneath clear blue skies where heavy clouds had once gathered. Nathan no longer measured success by business headlines or financial reports. Grace no longer carried unanswered questions alone. Emily and Liam continued building paper airplanes, convinced every airplane eventually found its way home if given enough sky. Inside Nathan's office, the faded letters rested beside one framed photograph taken on that sunny afternoon in the botanical garden. Whenever visitors asked why it remained the only personal picture on his desk, he always answered with the same quiet smile. Because the greatest things in life are never the ones you plan. They are the ones that patiently wait until your heart is finally ready to find them.